Has there ever been a game that has gotten more remakes than Myst? It seems that whenever technology bumps up another level, Cyan drops everything it's doing to give us yet another version of Myst just one more time. Now, I'm not complaining. It's been an adventure in and of itself to watch Myst mature the way it has. Each update gave the worlds of Myst a new look according to the expanding limits of technology for its period, and the result has been a succession of forever increasing realism, starting with a slideshow of postcards in 1993 and culminating with virtual reality in 2021. It's hard to see where Myst could go from here. At this point, the next stage of technology would have to warrant something so real we couldn't tell it was a simulation, and I don't expect Cyan will be securing a private island attraction anytime soon. Besides, Riven still hasn't been remade at all yet, and I for one would love to see Exile in true 3D as well, especially on Materia. So why am I calling attention back to Myst? What could possibly justify doing this game all over yet again? Well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, yet that's exactly what I put in the title. Now, if the only thing the prior remakes did was remaster the same worlds in higher fidelity, then there would be nothing to discuss here. But that is far from the case. Instead, each version also modified the aesthetics of the game and assumed a new character that was distinct from the ones before. There's nothing wrong with that on its face, but I do feel this left the door open for another look. More to the point, all the remakes that we have seen so far have consistently interpreted the original game through the same conceptual lens. Therefore, while each iteration did come another step closer to fully realizing the worlds of Myst, it only did so within that specific vision. However, that vision is not the only way to interpret the original Myst. So my goal is to revive a competing vision that's been dormant for many years, and hopefully I can convince you that it should no longer be ignored. This will be a 3-part series, exploring how Myst has changed over time, what may have been lost in the process, and some ways I think a remake could possibly bring those things back. Because this topic is philosophical in nature, this discussion could get a little abstract, so it's important that we start on solid ground. So the first episode will just focus on the current state of Myst and the vision that's been guiding the remakes. I can speculate on how and why people seem to be divided on it, but the other vision will have to wait until we have more context. Of course, given what I'm calling for, you probably figure that I must be unhappy with the most recent version of Myst that just came out in 2020 for the Quest and 21 for PC. But that's actually not the case at all. In fact, I greatly enjoyed this one, and had a fun time discovering the new changes. All of the ages of Myst have something new and interesting going on, and artistically speaking, they're beautifully done. But I'd have to say that my personal favorite was the Selenitic age. The increased mist on the surface and volcanic activity below not only greatly enhanced the atmosphere, but more vividly matched Atris's journal about the age as well. I've always known Selenitic became an unstable island after it was hit by a meteor storm, but this rendition captured the desolation on an emotional level that I had never experienced before. By the way, since I'll be comparing versions a lot, I can't call the recent one just plain Myst like it wants me to. Because the design primarily focused on the virtual reality side of things, I'll refer to the game as Myst VR, even when I'm not actually talking about the VR. Anyway, at its core, I do believe Myst VR is a fine addition to the line of remakes. It gave us worlds that once again definitely resemble Myst, but it also took the liberty to make improvements wherever it thought appropriate. These are the two key strengths you always look for in game developers. They must be able to work within the constraints presented to them, but also be willing to innovate and think outside the box. A good example is Cyan's decision to replace the tiny room at the base of the tree elevator. Now we get this much larger room that offers a vivid preview of the upcoming Channelwood Age. The decision makes sense, and the room itself looks really cool, so I'm glad they followed through with the idea. It should be noted that since the tree elevator now has to go much further down, it doesn't rise as high in the air as it used to, which means the view from the top is less impressive, and actually trying to catch the elevator going down may cut a little too close now. Still, Cyan decided that the change was worth it, and overall I agree it's an acceptable trade-off. However, I think their creativity did go a bit too far in some cases, especially when it came to the VR accommodations. While I understand VR was the priority, I question how much they let it directly affect the environments themselves, because it resulted in a bunch of small changes everywhere that I thought were a little strange. For example, just about every door with a hinge has been replaced with a sliding door, because apparently it's easy to get caught on the swinging doors in VR. fair enough, I suppose. Likewise, there used to be a few spots where your character might have to bend down, but the heights of these objects have all been adjusted to no longer require this, regardless of the implications. They didn't seem to care if it changes whether something accidental now looks like it was done on purpose, nor did they care how suddenly peculiar the end result might look. They also removed the ability to sit down in chairs for the same reason. I would like to believe they could have gotten around these problems in a different way, like an accessibility setting you could turn off if you didn't need it, or perhaps a button you could press on the VR sticks to bend down. I'm sure Cyan had its own reasons it didn't like those ideas. But I wish it wasn't done like this because I found it to be the most on-the-nose interruption of the immersion. Under no circumstances could I ever believe the Ages of Myst actually work like this. All I see are a bunch of blatant reminders everywhere that I'm playing a video game. And even worse for me, it's a game that was fundamentally designed for someone else. My first time playing was not in VR. Sadly, I'm pretty sure they're going to get all cute doing this while remaking Riven too, and I already hate it. One essential attribute of Riven is that this is a pre-existing world that was not made for you and doesn't care for your presence. So if that aspect is fundamentally reversed, it is no longer Riven. For example, since it is a decaying world, replacing the creaky hinges with slick sliding doors is going to be just weird. Were you looking forward to sitting in the maglevs, crawling through the boiler pipe, or falling out of the minecart just like the original game always teased you as a kid? Too bad, VR players are more important than you. Or even worse, imagine Gen intentionally designing his projector in such a way that he's not even able to sit in it, because he now also has developed a soft spot for VR players for some reason. That's some real immersion. Huh? Ugh. PC users that have been waiting 25 years deserve better than this. Or maybe I'm being too harsh. Cyan recently brought Richard van der Wen back as the director for the Riven remake, which is probably the greatest single step they could take to ensure the game will be authentic. They clearly want to get this right, and I should have faith in them. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. All this VR stuff actually has nothing to do with the main topic of this series. As I already said, what I really want to talk about is how the vision behind Myst has evolved over the years, and why I believe an alternate forgotten vision deserves another chance. Of course, I don't expect anything I say here will have any real influence. However, the last time I made a commentary video about it, it most certainly did catch Cyan's attention when I pointed out how the trees on Myst Island seem to be slowly disappearing with each new remake.
Really nice. And those trees, look at that. We've got trees with like needles and man, oh man.
Yeah.
Instead of just
don't be careful
blur.
with the tree. The fans are unhappy with the number of trees on Myst Island.
You know, okay, I don't want to bring this up, but there is a little bit of a, ever decreasing number of trees in every version of Myst Island that we do.
For context, it was a short video and mostly tongue-in-cheek, but it did make a point I felt was important. However, my real intention was to advance a vision that extends much further, and the trees were simply the best way to promote it by quickly making a meme about it. As effective memes are at getting people's attention though, they really aren't that good at conveying the broader picture. Rand and Eric appeared to be aware of this alternate vision, but unfortunately for the most part seemed to casually dismiss it. At first they described this vision as magical, eclectic, and whimsical, but after that they tend to agree that every new change that moves away from this vision is an improvement. So this time my goal is to present the full philosophical manifesto for this vision as plainly as I can, because I think it's far more relevant than they realize. So if this series is to live up to its name, then that gives me only one chance to make my case. It's a tall task, but here goes. Let's start by taking a look at the word vision, because you may have noticed I've been using it in a way that's a little unconventional. It's difficult for me to give it a formal definition, but I guess my best attempt would be an intuition about the nature of the world and how causation works within it. Or in our case, an intuition about these things for the world within the video game. You can think of a vision as the all-encompassing theory each person comes up with based on their experience and their personality. However, visions are also usually subconscious and therefore are often left unspoken. So it's similar to how Dr. Thomas Sowell uses it in his book, A Conflict of Visions, except it's not political. Just how many visions of Myst are there? Well, each person has their own perspective and imagination, so I guess there are just as many visions of Myst as there are people who've played it. But I have had many discussions with other Myst fans, and in my experience, most of them fall within one of two categories, so I think it's fine to say there are two major visions of Myst. Here I'll cover the current one that's been driving the development of the remakes, and the other is that magical vision that will have to wait until the next episode for me to really dive into it. So here we go. What is the vision that's been driving the development? Well, there's no need to speculate when we can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Let's pick up this stream when Ren sums up the original game and pivots to how the approach has changed ever since.
Yeah, the original Myst was, we'll just say, eclectic, because as Robin and I were designing it, we kind of knew what we wanted to have, and we wanted this variety of ages, and we wanted this story that was behind it and these places to go, but we also didn't want it necessarily to feel sci-fi or too locked down. And the fact was, we were experimenting as we were building it anyway. So it had a very, well, you called it magical. I think Robin's even described it that way. It's a little bit of a,
or maybe whimsical is a better term.
Whimsical or mythological, or something behind the scenes that you weren't quite sure how things were running, and it was okay. You were okay suspending that disbelief. And Riven came, and we doubled down on a lot of the realism there, and I think people loved that. But again, people's cup of tea is different things for different people. Myst still has a little bit of a magical feel, but as we've done different versions, we've tried to improve some of the less explained things, or things we had to, kind of do less realistically. The map alone, okay, and I don't know if this is one of the things you are mentioning, but
it is.
Yeah, I think
for us, it was like two birds with one stone, because on one hand, it clarifies for the player, it pulls back a little bit of that whimsy and replaces it with more mechanical explanation for, like, Atris actually, like, this is a machine. It's not a magic painting, right? It's not a...
Yeah.
In fact,
right.
I even went so far when we did this display. If we look close, you can even see there's almost like scan lines, as if there's a display behind the paint strokes on the painting.
Yeah, it's very cool.
To try to explain away some of that stuff. But then it also solved a non-trivial interface problem, which is VR, when you're manipulating everything with your hands. How are they gonna reach into the painting? How are they gonna manipulate the tower? And so it ended up solving some things, and we took that same philosophy, and we'll see it throughout our little playthrough here.
Well, you heard them. Now that VR has radically altered the primary interface, Cyan decided to remove the mysticism from Myst and instead try to reconstruct its worlds to be as realistic as possible. But a gradual shift toward realism has already been taking place for a long time. In fact, this goal has been explicitly stated ever since the first remake. But now we have worlds that look so real you think you can just reach out and grab them. Ironically, the wonderful thing about video games is that they're supposed to give us an opportunity to escape reality. So any design attempt at matching back up with reality once again is entirely voluntary. Since not all games choose to do this, it deserves a name. From this point onward, I will refer to this design approach as the Rationalist Vision. Like it sounds, it's the notion everything needs a rational explanation, and as we just established, each new remake of Myst bends toward this vision more than the previous one did. So it's not just that realism has increased visually, but so has the need for explanations of causality. For example, on the mechanical age, Myst VR added more gears and expanded the size of the track to create a more believable system realistically capable of rotating such a large, heavy fortress. Or consider how the puzzle in the well on the Stone Ship Age has changed. There used to be a loose treasure chest that would always conveniently float to the right spot around the spiral staircase without explanation. But now it's replaced by a clear rope and pulley system that relies on no such coincidence or magic. Not only do these changes make the goals of their respective puzzles clearer, but they also provide excellent examples of the Rationalist Vision. But the creative shift in this direction is more profound than this alone would suggest, because rationalism is pervasive in all the aesthetics of the game too. In fact, this may be the most obvious example of the same reliable shift occurring across all the remakes. Originally, the buildings and structures of Myst were very clean and looked like they could have been built yesterday. But ever since then, the reimagined worlds have displayed greater levels of decay and corrosion, culminating in much of Myst VR having a very aged look. As Ren seemed to suggest, it does indeed often feel like Cyan actually wanted this game to take after the sequel Riven, even more than it did the original Myst. It goes without saying, of course, that technological advances have played a huge part in this trajectory as well, because reality was obviously far too detailed and complex to replicate 30 years ago. Instead, back then each game company invented its own style out of necessity just to get the most out of what it had. This is what made Myst so unique especially, as it was Cyan's only serious game at the time. But today we're much more advanced, so the worlds we create can directly match whatever we have in mind. However, while it is great that we can simulate real life much more accurately, a side effect is it can sometimes result in a certain uniformity in the outputs. After all, they all had the same goal and now they're getting there. Of course, there is still plenty room for creativity within the Rationalist Vision, as the aesthetics can still vary from place to place. Even the rules can deviate a bit, as long as everything remains consistent. Take Cyan's 2016 science fiction game Abduction, for example, and particularly how the teleportation method always transports matter in perfect spheres. I'm not aware of anything like this in real life, but if such a thing were to exist, it somehow makes sense that spheres would be exactly what we would expect. And it's the same with Myst. Some necessary fictional elements have to carry over in order to make the original storyline work. But as the Rationalist Vision continues to be adopted with each update, the form and function of its worlds increasingly adhere to rules similar to that of our own world whenever possible. So, the end result of Cyan adopting the Rationalist Vision is that Myst VR creates a consistent and believable universe. It conforms to similar laws of physics, entropy, and decay that we find in our own universe. And like all previous versions of the game, it takes advantage of up-to-date technology in its capacity to do so. In other words, Myst now looks like it could be a real place. Therefore, one must conclude this is the absolutely definitive Myst, and there's nowhere to go from here, and that's that. Right? Well, you can probably guess which way I lean, or else I wouldn't have made this video. But the burden of proof doesn't fall on the negatives, so let's be sure to frame the question properly. By this point, Cyan has given itself many opportunities to reinvent the same classic game in any fashion they wanted. And as technology advances, new choices and possibilities continually open up. So, why is more realism the answer every single time? Is realism always better every time? Of course, I'm not claiming it should never have been tried. But if the original classic was more of a hybrid, then I am questioning why this change has been so dogmatically pursued ever since. After listening to multiple interviews, I could only come up with two possible explanations for why Cyan insists on taking Myst in this direction. Because it's not just limited to the puzzle mechanics, they're converting the entire environments wholesale. One theory is that Cyan may have trapped itself into this way of thinking due to its own evolution. Myst was kind of their in-between game, and before Myst they made several children's games that weren't based in realism at all. Then after Myst they made Riven, a game for older audiences that was highly acclaimed for its extraordinary realism. So naturally, they now tend to assume realism strongly correlates with older appeal, and anything outside that is probably not going to be taken seriously. The other theory is that perhaps Cyan believes the only way to fully engage the player is to make the environment sufficiently realistic. But that would be confusing immersion, i.e. players feel they are physically present in worlds they like to believe might exist, with rationalism, i.e. the worlds themselves behave as closely to our world as possible. The problem is that the conclusion simply does not follow either way, so either correlation would just be an illusion unique to Cyan. In the broader world of adventure games, I don't really see this being a thing. Some games can get you completely sucked in not despite their fantasy elements, but precisely because of them. And I'm sure you can think of other games that look like real places that didn't draw you in at all. Besides, if all I want is ultimate realism, I'll just go outside.
So I mean, this is so realistic. I feel like that's a real tree. It's got shape and form. It's all 3D. There's real butterflies flying above me. I can see the sun over there.
Yeah, that's nice, but if I go to my local park, I can actually feel the tree too. And I don't even have to worry about software glitches or motion sickness or any of that stuff either. In case I haven't made myself clear, I'm not saying that realism in video games is bad. I just don't think it's required to give the player that sense of immersion, and so realism for its own sake doesn't mean very much. Rather, if you really insist on realism, you're better off if you can justify how it ties in with the story. More on that as we go along. Because one thing you must bear in mind about realism is that it's not entirely flexible. It comes with certain caveats. I don't know if you've noticed this, but reality is messy. Nothing is ever as simple or straightforward as we might wish. Even the best things usually come with at least some flaws and trade-offs. For example, imagine taking a trip to the lake. In your head, the blue lake will be perfect, cool, and clear, but once you get there, you realize it's actually green, not clear at all, and even smells a little funny. The bugs are super annoying, and you'll be lucky to get out of here without a severe sunburn. Maybe you'll still find a way to have a good time, but the point is you have to take the good with the bad. You wish you could take all the yin without any of the yang, but you can't. That's life. That's the Rationalist Vision. And that's the messy reality that all earnest attempts at realism in video games must strive toward. And it's what Myst VR always drags me into, even when the experience becomes rather unpleasant. In fact, I feel like I'm dying when I stand by the windmill here. The humidity must be like 230%, while the sun appears to be much closer than our own. I'm pretty sure I'll suffer heat stroke if I stand here too long, not to mention the swamp water absolutely reeks. The fact the game convinces me to this depth proves just how well it's put together. But why? Why is it important for them to make me so uncomfortable that I don't want to linger here? How is this a good gaming experience? And more importantly, how does it advance the story? Frankly, I don't really understand. Although we can only speculate as to why Cyan became this attached to the Rationalist Vision, we do know exactly when it happened. They took a rather deliberate shift in philosophy while designing Riven, the first time they hired Richard van der Wende.
He ended up, I think, giving Riven something that we could have never given it. It was just another voice, and a very strong, mature voice with a lot of talent that was saying, hey, why don't we try doing it in this direction a little bit? Why don't we just kind of push it? We were kind of like we were stumbling around trying to find a style for this thing. Most of our stumbling around was still a little bit too much in the direction of Myst. It still had a kind of that romantic architecture.
We were determined to do something better than what Myst was.
After he came, he imbued the whole project with a flavor that was a bit more edgy and strange and odd. It wouldn't have been as cool if he hadn't been around.
Riven became a place to us as we were designing it. Richard and Robin were picturing themselves there. It was part of what we were doing.
Our attempt was to make elements in the Riven world look old and used and broken in. Because you see a lot of computer-generated art that looks plasticky or new or somehow strange. It doesn't look real.
We're used to weathered things. That implies reality.
Looking back, this was obviously the right decision for the sequel. It's hard to put into words how incredible it was to experience Riven back in the 90s. One of my favorite childhood memories, in fact, was to turn out the lights and wander around the islands for hours without even attempting to solve a puzzle. Some images in particular really stood out that made me wonder how they weren't just photographs of real places. But while the realistic images were impressive in their own right, these alone were not what turned Riven into a masterpiece. Again, what matters more is how well the applied vision ties directly into the story, and in this case, Riven is one of the finest examples I've ever encountered. The extreme corrosion you see across Riven may indeed be an artistic style, a technological crowning achievement for its day, and a practical way to give the player that sense of immersion all in one. But none of these are at the center of the game's greatness. No, the true majesty of this game is how every last detail draws the player into the story, and the thematic realism and decay are certainly no exception. Riven is a dying age in its final moments, losing its battle against itself trying to hold together. The whole reason the Fifth Age is unstable in the first place is because Gen has a god complex that makes him think he's far better at writing ages than he actually is. This curses the Age of Riven to suffer fatal flaws and instabilities that don't exist in Atris's writings. And you can sense it. In the environment. Everywhere you look. Every remnant of decay is a direct embodiment of Gen's most prominent character flaw, a failure to grasp a greater macrocosm that ultimately overpowered him in his delusions. So as you can see, the pervasive realism in Riven is not just an aesthetic choice or an extraneous detail. It's an inherent characteristic of Riven that bears direct significance to the plot. So why does Cyan always try to make Myst more and more like Riven over time, when it doesn't host the same conditions? I offered a couple theories earlier, but one way or another, it appears Cyan believes this is the only way people will take the game seriously. But I don't think that's true at all, and there are valid reasons to retain Myst's original magic. Not only does Myst itself become more compelling this way in my opinion, but the resulting contrast between Myst and Riven also creates a remarkably profound duo. So while Cyan may be hesitant to make the two games different, I'm sitting here wondering why they have to be the same. This is the alternate vision, however, so the full case for it will have to wait until the next episode. While I do believe Cyan has overlooked something important here, I still trust their storytelling otherwise, of course, because that is how they rose to the top in the first place. Abduction also renewed my confidence in them more recently because it checks all the boxes. It has a rich backstory, worlds that are captivating to explore, and puzzles that are unapologetic in their difficulty. I will admit I found Firmament to be a simpler game than Abduction, so perhaps the bar was set a little high. Still, I would say both games have unique strengths and work in their own way. Ultimately, the reason for this though is that these games were native to the vision of the current team, which is why they felt so natural, and perhaps also why they're so fun to play in VR. But Myst is a different animal altogether, so they should not assume the same approach will just smoothly translate right over. It's been around longer than some of the newer devs have even been alive, so they need to bear in mind that its long history can throw in some complications. Otherwise, they're going to get controversies flaring up like the one recently about how the characters look. In case you don't know, in the original game, the creators Rand and Robin Miller put themselves in the game as live actors. And this is what we got used to seeing because traditionally all the remakes kept the original grainy QuickTime movies too, even as the rest of the graphics continue to evolve around them. But Myst VR changed this by switching over to using 3D models for all the characters. And the justification makes sense. Obviously, if you want your character to appear properly in a 3D environment, you have to render it in 3D as well so it can be viewed from different angles. Nevertheless, Cyan suffered such a huge backlash for this that eventually they added an option to bring back the old FMVs, at least for the books and imagers. This backlash is of special interest to us because it reveals how the fans are split between the two visions, and so it's a perfect case study of what happens when there is more than one vision at play. I would even call it a conflict of visions, but that name's already taken. On the surface, there doesn't seem to be much of a conflict among the fans at all. Most of the ones I've talked to generally agree in that they do not like the new models. Sorry, Cyan, I'm just the messenger. However, your full opinion on the models may vary widely depending on which vision you ascribe to. On one side, the backlash tends to be from people simply saying that these specific models just didn't look very good. However, the other side seems so hopelessly attached to the live actors that they probably wouldn't even care if the models did cross the uncanny valley. That's where the role of conflicting visions comes in. When visions collide, they don't necessarily hold directly opposing views, they just trip over one another because they're trying to occupy the same space. They might think they even agree on some things when they're actually reasoning from very different positions. In other words, they have a hidden disagreement somewhere that neither side is consciously aware of. That's why it's key to recognize that the criticism actually takes two different forms. If you ascribe to the rationalist vision, then this issue is simply one of aesthetics, and so your opinion varies depending on your taste. You're likely to just be unhappy with these particular models and wish they switched to something that met a higher standard. But if you hold the alternate vision, you're almost certainly going to be upset with Cyan just for switching to using models at all. I still haven't covered the alternate vision yet, but for now it suffices to say that it works best with live actors. Now, a word of caution. If you do hold this alternate vision, you may find it difficult to articulate exactly why live actors is a better choice. After all, visions are rooted fundamentally in the subconscious. But you should come up with a better reason than simply that this was the way it was done before, because as long as your complaints come across as mere remnants of nostalgia, then Cyan will continue to dismiss your perspective. Besides, I'm not certain this vision necessarily requires the old recordings per se. I'll offer my own thoughts after I cover this vision in more detail in the next episode. Generally speaking, whenever you see visions that clash like this, you'd like to think it would be possible to find a compromise, but unfortunately that usually doesn't work and it just ends up leaving nobody happy. Anything you see that accommodates the other vision will just stand out and look unacceptable in your own. In the case here, the throwback option was only partially applied, so Cyan is clearly just throwing a meager nostalgia bone at the opposing vision which they otherwise don't understand. Needless to say, the rationalists find this out of place, and the alternates find it inadequate. Although the two visions hold disagreements all over the game, it's no surprise that the character models turned out to be where it all bubbled over. See, when people are tasked with recognizing faces instead of just ordinary objects, their mindset completely changes and they become far more attentive to detail. It's not fair, but that's just the way it is. There are studies that indicate this even takes place in a completely different part of the brain. So it's no wonder everyone suddenly became extra critical, and that's why I don't think this problem can be overstated. In fact, I would even say this conflict reveals an identity crisis within Myst. Think about it. One vision is now trying to be as realistic as possible, but also wants to use 3D models for its characters. Meanwhile, the other vision may prefer something overall less realistic, but as part of it they need real actors to experience it. One vision wants the characters to blend in with the environment, the other wants them to stand out. The real tragedy, though, is if you go down the rabbit hole, you'll discover that common ground is surprisingly tough to find, as if the two sides hold different fundamental views about what Myst even is. How did this happen? Why did we split off into multiple visions in the first place? I think the answer lies in the original game, and specifically how the limited technology caused us to interpret the worlds of Myst in different ways. It may have all been just one big miscommunication. So let's break down how that could have happened. First of all, whenever two people try to communicate in any context, they must do so over what's called a medium. If the medium is simple and reliable, such as legible handwriting or decent phone service, then whenever a message is sent by one party, we can be optimistic that it will be received by the other just fine. But if you're dealing with an unreliable medium, in this example the pawns are playing a game of telephone, there's a high probability the message will be corrupted, resulting in the final message received often looking much different from the original intended one. Now, in the world of gaming, the game itself is the medium, and the more limited the medium, the more the message gets corrupted. Of course, in the 90s, this medium was very limited, so maybe you can see where this is going. A developer may have all kinds of cool ideas in their head they want to put into a game, but that medium restricted what they could actually produce. This was exacerbated all the more in the case of Cyan, since they were highly ambitious in their vision and tried everything they could think of to stuff as much content as they could onto a CD. But unfortunately, no matter what they did, the output likely still fell short of the vision in their mind. Then the real problem starts once the game ships over to us, because we couldn't see their vision directly. We only saw that final product with all those constraints baked right into it, from the low-resolution images and sounds to the restricted interface and viewing angles. If you think about it, we had no conclusive way to distinguish intended and desired outputs from compromises and sometimes even mistakes. The only thing we had to go on was that bundled information, which we then had to unpack into our own interpretation of what these worlds are really supposed to be. Make no mistake, we loved what we saw, but there's a good chance it wasn't the same as the original vision. This loss in translation can happen even with the simplest of attributes. Take the iconic hand cursor for instance. From the developer's perspective, this was probably little more than the way interaction had to be done in HyperCard. But there's nothing stopping a player's imagination from running wild on it. Am I really making these weird hand gestures to myself as I move around? Is this a floating hand that acts as a magical guide helping me through the adventure? Or perhaps I am the floating hand? I've heard people attribute sentimental value to this hand almost to the point of incorporating it as a basic part of the Myst lore. Meanwhile, even though Myst VR didn't completely remove the hand on flat screen, they've now diminished it to a bland opt-in feature in the menus. Regardless of whether you think that's warranted, the point is the developers clearly do not share in that vision. Now, you might be wondering, if low technology is what causes these miscommunications, wouldn't this sort of thing be a problem for all games in the 90s? Well, perhaps to some degree. But Myst is a special case because of the stuff I covered earlier in this video. So now we're finally ready to build the full diagram and see how it all ties together. Once again, we see the game acting as the medium between the devs and the players, and the ensuing miscommunication that follows. But this time we're going to try to explain how the visions might have split. One thing to keep in mind here is that our imaginations aren't limited like the medium is, so we actually conjure up expanded versions of what we see. These worlds in our minds are effectively what we're hoping will finally be made in the future once technology allows. But while the medium doesn't stop us from dreaming up whatever universes that tickle our fancy, it does create a risk we won't all match up with one another. Now on the input side, as I said before, Cyan couldn't fit their expanded vision of Myst into the original game, so instead they had to compress it to accommodate the medium. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a clear picture of what the developers' exact vision of Myst was in 1993. That's kind of the whole point of this. But we do know a couple things. One is that element of immersion. There's no disputing the fact that Cyan has always wanted to create worlds that felt like we could fully engross ourselves in and feel we were physically there. As part of that effort, they wanted the objects and landmarks to appear familiar enough to be believable. Let's represent this realistic component with a red color. Cyan tried to do whatever they could to maximize this effect, but were obviously held back due to the size of the medium. HyperCard just isn't the same as VR. Then there's that element of magic that also permeated the original game. Let's use a blue color for this one. Once again, we can only speculate as to how exactly Cyan felt about it back then. It could have been a latent carryover from their whimsical children's games, or perhaps it arose naturally as part of their early experimentation phase. There may even be story ramifications which I'll have to get into another time. Whatever the case, there was a limit to how much they could stuff this into the medium as well. Still images and tiny QuickTime movies don't provide the most dynamic special effects. And then the game shipped over to us, with players having no way of knowing the intended balance of realistic familiarity and unrealistic mysticism. All we could see was that the final product had a fair bit of both, and so that was the thing we had to try to unpack. Now here's how I think we split into the two camps. It all comes down to whether you believe these properties are intrinsic to Myst. By intrinsic, I'm referring to the things you think are so important the game simply can't do without them. Obviously a remake must include those things too, otherwise there's a risk you won't consider the new version to be an upgrade. Or in the worst case, you may no longer even consider it to be the same game. Now, by and large, we all agree the red component is intrinsic. This means pretty much all of us amplify this element in our minds, and long for more immersive and believable environments. Where we disagree is the blue component. If you don't think it's intrinsic, then it's okay for much of this part to be modified or even removed in later updates. Therefore, with red left standing as the dominant intrinsic property, Myst is chiefly defined by its physical attributes, which leads your expanded vision to consist of more rationalistic versions of its worlds, subject to artistic interpretation. But perhaps you do see this mix of real and unreal as the very essence of Myst, the one thing that gave it its captivating uniqueness. This calls to mind a completely different vision of what Myst could become. Again, I haven't covered this vision yet, but it does hold some kind of a heightened version of this blend. So we've likely had this split in visions from the very beginning. But the good news is that technology advances over time, which in other words means the medium expands. This is why they keep making remakes. Fewer sacrifices have to be made with each one, until finally technology has advanced enough that the game can now handle a whole vision in its entirety. No more sacrifices, limitations, or trade-offs. This means Cyan can finally inject its full true vision into the game, and we in turn are able to experience their authentic vision directly for the first time. This is what arguably makes Myst VR the ultimate and definitive iteration of Myst. The devs certainly seem to think so. They even set Myst as its official name. Just Myst. No modifiers or qualifications like all the previous remakes had. It's a bold move and really goes to show how satisfied they are with their product and how it fulfills their vision. But if I'm being completely honest, it doesn't sit right with me. Sure, I've had to use a different name to avoid confusion while comparing different versions, but that's not what really bothers me. It's the implication that this is the only proper vision of what Myst is supposed to be, superseding everything including the original game itself. To me, this just comes off as rather tone-deaf. Don't forget that Cyan has modified its own vision over that same time period. We know their vision has changed, you just saw them admit it on stream. The original magical feel was included deliberately, The incomplete laws of causation gave the worlds a mystique that always invited the player to explore further. But now Cyan has soured on this magic, even trying to remove it wherever they can. They must view it as nothing more than a gap in the plot, a remnant of inexperience, a weakness to be patched up. So their goal became to reduce this unreal component as much as they could, a change that was simultaneously evolving alongside the effect of their vision becoming more clear to us. Of course, anyone who likewise saw the magical element as non-essential will go along with this change just fine. But what about the other group? Removing the magic from the worlds of Myst is no trivial matter for us, and possibly even threatens our willingness to recognize it as Myst altogether. This is how several conversations have gone during my live streams playing this game, so I know I'm not alone. Is it right for us to remain forgotten just because we happen to interpret what we saw through that original primitive window differently? Well, I suppose maybe so, actually. You could easily argue the devs hold the exclusive right to resolve this issue however they want because it's their game, and anyone else can pound sand. But listen to what Eric Anderson says at the end of the stream.
Our objective with this was not to recreate Myst verbatim. It wasn't just to make a higher fidelity version of Myst, because we've got other versions and we deviated pretty hard in a few places. And for me, the objective for this was to not recreate Myst, but it was to recreate your memory of what Myst was from when you were a kid. 30. How many years has it been now? A couple of years. Yeah. And the objective was to try to tap into that distant memory of these places and try and deliver to a modern standard what that feeling is, and I feel like we did a pretty decent job.
I'm sorry. I don't know about you, but that really pinches a nerve when I hear him say that. He just spent the whole hour boasting about how he deliberately sapped all the magic out of the game, and now he's rubbing it in my face as if nothing of value was lost. It's as if he thinks he can bake the same cake with completely different ingredients. Look, I'm really grateful that Cyan still cares about its flagship game and continues to do what it can to keep it up to date after all these years. I'm also being honest when I say that I'm genuinely intrigued by the particular interpretive direction the current team decided to take it. But this experience was most definitely not anything like I remember, and him claiming as such is what crosses the line for me. I'd love nothing more than to finally witness some fulfilled presentation of Myst that I had always been waiting for, but this doesn't feel like that at all. I can appreciate many of the changes on a technical level, but that's not the same thing. I've heard some people say that the reason Myst can't find its old magic is that the conditions are simply not reproducible, that they're a relic of 90s optimism that always arises with rudimentary technology. Others just say that nostalgia is clouding everyone's thought process and creating an impossible standard. But that can't be all it is, because you also have to consider people like Backlog Busters too. He didn't play any version of Myst until this year, yet he also ranks the original game over the two most recent remakes. He didn't single out any sort of magical component per se, but he can tell there's just something different about the old game that makes that his main recommendation. If Myst VR was clearly the consummate version of Myst, then newcomers wouldn't talk like this. One final but very important point I need to clarify. I've been calling this a magical element because I haven't really explored it yet, and it's a decent enough term while looking at the big picture. But the truth is that term is actually rather imprecise. So if you also feel the remakes have lost something significant, but the word magic doesn't sound right to you, I ask that you just wait until I release the second episode. It's possible we agree more than you realize. While it can be considered a form of magic, once you understand the alternate vision, you'll see why there's certainly more to it than that. This particular magic is more of an innate quality of the worlds of Myst, rather than a supernatural force or a mere reference to the unexplained. It will take a whole separate episode to identify it properly and determine why it's essential. So while Cyan might think Myst is a done deal, I myself believe we still have unfinished business.